The history as our guide. Now, the deeper I get into the science, the more I am convinced that history is our one and truly our only guide. What do I mean by that? So, in order to understand that, so first let's take the science part, right? So there's science and there's history. Um, when people refer to science, especially nutrition science, what are they usually referring to? Um, so in order to do, let's first take what real science would be. Real science would be real outcomes reported on real people in controlled conditions, right? So we can't really do this for people, but if you have two groups of mice that are sufficiently big enough, 100 mice in each subset, and I basically have the conditions identical for those two mice. They're similar genetics, which unfortunately lab mice are too similar genetically. That's a different discussion. But I have similar genetically, and then I'm gonna wake them up, put them to sleep, treat them exactly the same way, with one exception. One group I'm going to give metformin or some other pharmaceutical to, and one group I'm not. Then I can draw conclusions about the difference between what metformin does in a mouse, right? That's a clear scientific example. And especially I can do that because mice don't have very long lives. So if I do that experiment for a year, that's maybe, I don't know, a fifth of a mouse's lifespan. So that's pretty significant, right? Now, the problem is to do that with humans, first of all, it's not ethical. But even if it could be ethical, even if you could get people to sign the waiver, and there are unethical studies done in earlier eras, but how long were those studies done for? They were done for like 12 weeks. Maybe they were also done for 6 months or a year. In the case of the Minnesota starvation experiment, I think it was 6 months or maybe even a year. But um, even that, so a year in the case of a human is 1/100th, is 1% of the human's lifespan. A year in the case of a mouse, maybe 20% of the mouse's lifespan. So in other words, the data is just not enough. Even if it's the best we can do, even violating the ethical standards is not very good. Okay. So we can't do real science, whatever that would be in humans, right? So what are we left with? We're left with the animal models, as we've discussed. The problem is we're not mice, we're not rhesus monkeys, we're not bacteria, we're not any of these things that we can actually experiment on. So that's the animal models have their limitations, but they could be useful. They could be interesting. They could raise some questions, right? And then what most people refer to as nutritional science is the epidemiological data based on food frequency questionnaires, right? And that is ridiculously bad data. Why? Because people lie. People don't even remember. I hesitate to call it lying because people don't even remember. Like if you ask them what they ate last week or even yesterday, people will do their best. But honestly speaking, most of us are going to tell the person asking the question what we think the person wants to hear, right? So if we think salads are healthy, we will inflate our consumption of salads, especially if it's a open-ended question like how many salads did you eat last year? You think the person wants to hear that you ate a salad every day, so you're going to write 365 or whatever it is, right? So that's the kind of logic that most of us are using when we're filling out a food frequency questionnaire. And we know that, by the way, because you can have people follow the person who's keeping the food frequency questionnaire, follow them around with a notebook. And we found that there's very little resemblance between what the people eat and what the people say they're eating. This is very well understood in terms of the methodology around epidemiology and food frequency questionnaires, right? So animal models we've dealt with, food frequency questionnaires and epidemiology we've dealt with. There's also the biological plausibility stuff, right? So you can find out, and here's something that I'm probably guilty of. People will accuse me of using this example, that we have when we take cells in a petri dish, we can see human cells or whatever cultivated cells. We can see issues to do with energy production, right? We can see that there's this Randall cycle issue, which I've talked about in other videos, which is that humans cannot burn fat and glucose at the same time. So if you're eating mixed meals of both fat and carbohydrate in terms of your energy substrate, that's going to cause problems at the mitochondrial level. That's not really in dispute, to be honest. So that's not in dispute. Why? Because we can see that in the mechanism. Now, from that, does it follow that having a mixed meal is a bad idea? Not necessarily, right? But that seems pretty logical to me. But one could argue, well, there are lots of things that seem like biological plausibilities, like lots of medications that have been tested on one or the other pathway. In fact, I would say we don't really know, because when a medication fails, when a pharmaceutical drug fails to make it to market, they don't have to tell us often if they don't get to a certain stage of the trial. But I would guess somewhere between 70 and 90% of drugs ever tested over the last century, completely failed, even though 100% of them would have had some kind of biological plausibility going into them. So just because we see things in a petri dish doesn't mean it has a real world application, right? And I think this is again very well understood. Everything I'm going to say in this particular video is not controversial at all. So we have the animal models, which may tell us something about monkeys and rats and protozoa and so on, but don't necessarily tell us anything about humans. We have the food frequency questionnaires, which really only tell us that humans tend to lie a lot, and we know this again by looking at different outcomes, and there's lots of ways that we can document that, and we lie to ourselves. And we have the petri dish data, which tells us that lots of things may have a biological plausibility, but even if it's biologically plausible, it may not actually be happening. So my perspective as sort of a philosophy of science, a person with an anthropology background, is like all of this stuff is interesting, but geez, man, I would not want to make decisions around what I eat based on all of this, right? So what's another starting point? Another starting point is to say, look, humans, not that different from every other biological system on the planet, plants and animals, in that we evolved in a certain context at a certain point in time to play a certain role in a certain ecosystem or maybe set of ecosystems. I would argue probably only one ecosystem. Depends where in human evolution you want to start the story. But by and large, we were in savanna areas, here in Africa. We were hunting large game, large fatty game. This was during the Ice Age. So there were much, much bigger, fattier animals than exist currently today. And stable nitrogen isotope analysis basically confirms this, right? So humans have been hunting large animals, including ruminants, for including prehumans for 4 million years, or at least 2.5 million years. But in our anatomically modern humans, for as long as they've existed, 350,000 years ago or maybe more, until about 15,000 years ago or 12,000 years ago, that's pretty much all we were eating. Now, when I say all, people tend to take me very literally, and they say, no, you're advocating for a completely carnivorous diet. Not necessarily, but if you want to do that, that's also fine. But I am advocating for understanding a historical diet, which would have been 80% fatty meat, basically fatty meat, or maybe eggs, or things that resemble in their makeup things like fatty meat, right? Why 70, 80%? Because that's what we define as hypercarnivores, right? There are other, and that's again where we fall. We fall as more carnivorous than your lions and your tigers and all that kind of stuff. Also eating some scavenged meat, it looks like, based on what we can tell from the nitrogen isotope analysis. Scavenged meat, in the case of anatomically modern humans, probably just means aged meat, right? Because you were killing a big elephant or whatever it was, you had to find ways to dry it and so on. And it's very clear that early humans did this. Neanderthals also did this kind of stuff. This is very well documented in the literature, right? So taking that historical perspective, in my view, is just a much better starting point than nutrition science as it currently exists, if that makes any sense. Now, once you take that as a starting point, then the other thing people will say to me is, well, I tried that, Samir, and it didn't work. Well, yeah, okay, fine. There are lots of diets that fall within the range of 70% plus meat. So if you tried one and it failed, it doesn't mean that they're all going to fail, number one. Number two, I'm not saying, humans in their natural form, or any animal in its sort of natural state, health looks the same, but sickness looks a million different things, right? So in order to understand that, in order to say, look, we need to have some degree of bioindividuality when we're trying to deal with the sickness. But in order to get a starting point, you need some kind of an ancestrally appropriate diet, and you need to stick to it for a certain period of time. And only then can we say, okay, this doesn't seem to be working. What do we need to add? What do we need to take away? Do we need to supplement? Do we need to use medications? Do we need to do sauna? Do we need to do, there are many other possibilities. There's a million tricks we could use in the case of something that's not someone who's not able to optimize their diet on an ancestrally appropriate diet. But you have to start there. Again, because I don't trust any other starting point. I don't trust the Mediterranean diet. I don't trust any of these other places as a good starting point. The only thing I trust is the anthropological literature, because it's really hard to fake nitrogen isotope analyses from 200 different locations all over the world, et cetera, right? So given that we understand that history, if you are unhealthy and you're looking to do anything about your health, improve your health, an ancestrally appropriate diet, which would be a hyper carnivorous diet, is the starting point, is the only logical starting point as far as I'm concerned, based on the current quality of the evidence. Okay? What do you think? Do you think I should be putting more stock in nutritional epidemiology and other forms of nutritional science? Let me know in the comments down below. Like I say, I've spent hours reading these studies, days, weeks, months, years. I mean, it's been a long time reading some of this literature. and I'm just not impressed. You can poke holes in pretty much every study, and people will say you can poke holes in other forms of literature too. I'm not so sure. And I also, it just jibes with what I'm seeing across the board. When people who are sick try and adopt a more ancestrally appropriate diet, almost always they don't. Sometimes I'm not saying people get 100% healed, but at least they take a step or two in the right direction. I'm hundred. I mean, I myself have worked with hundreds of clients. We see it time and time and time again. We don't see any exceptions really. People at least, again, not I'm not talking about completely cured, and maybe we still have to keep some medications. Maybe we have to do other things too, but you move in the right direction. We've seen this again and again. I've seen this with people coming off of whatever diet you choose, like vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean, keto, whatever your diet fad is. When you lose the fads and go back to an ancestrally appropriate human diet, then we start seeing a significant amount of progress. Okay, what are your thoughts? Let me know down below. I'll see you in the next one.